Hi, welcome to our policy proposal for Illinois. In the following slides, we will discuss biofuel and the possibilities it creates for a green future for Illinois.
In 2016, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change held a summit in Paris, France, where 197 parties signed an agreement that expressed a commitment to taking action to address the real and growing concerns of climate change. While the United States is no longer formally committed to the Paris Accord, a number of states have pledged to independently work to meet the stipulations agreed upon in the Paris Accord. The primary goal is to keep the global temperature increase of the century below 2 degrees Celsius and to work to lower the increase under 1.5 degrees Celsius. The 15 states and one territory included in the U.S. Climate Alliance are calling for smart, coordinated state action to ensure that the United States continues to contribute to the global effort to address climate change. While Illinois has not yet signed on to the U.S. Climate Alliance, we believe that it would be an ideal candidate. Illinois has the fourth highest emissions of any U.S. state, but its government has already expressed a willingness to move towards green infrastructure through legislation such as the Chicago Climate Action Plan and the Future Energy Jobs Act, both of which will be discussed in much greater depth shortly. Additionally, Illinois has experienced a declining manufacturing economy, and thus a shift to more sustainable technology and infrastructure would be an ideal solution to stimulate economic growth while addressing climate change. 21% of all Illinois citizens live in Chicago, and 74% live in the greater Chicago area, otherwise known as Chicagoland, which includes the city and its suburbs. As a result, while Illinois is an expansive state outside of Chicago, our proposal will focus somewhat on the Chicago metropolitan area, as it contains the majority of the Illinois population and its emissions. While Chicagoland includes some counties in Indiana and Wisconsin, the vast majority of its population is in the state of Illinois, meaning that the data collected for this area largely reflects the trends of the state. To address the pressing reality of climate change, former Chicago Mayor Richard Daley created a multi-stakeholder task force and chartered the Chicago Climate Action Plan in 2008, a brief that detailed Chicago's vision and strategies for climate mitigation and adaptation. The 5 major strategies put forth were energy-efficient buildings, clean and renewable energy sources, improved transportation options, reduced waste and industrial pollution, and adaptation. While specific strategies are suggested in this comprehensive proposal, there was little real legislation accompanying the Chicago Climate Action Plan to enforce any particular aspect of it. In December of 2016, the Illinois General Assembly passed the Future Energy Jobs Act, described by the Illinois Citizens Utility Board as one of the most significant pieces of energy legislation ever to pass the Illinois General Assembly. Among other goals, this bill requires Commonwealth Edison and Ameren, Illinois, the state's 2 biggest electric utilities, to dramatically expand their energy efficiency programs and reduce electricity waste, lowering Illinois power bills by billions of dollars through 2030. This legislation took effect on June 1, 2017, but within the same month, Ameren, Illinois filed its initial 4-year energy efficiency plan with the Illinois Commerce Commission as required under the new law, but the company's plan did not meet any of the annual savings targets prescribed by the statute, according to the report from the Natural Resource Defense Fund. The plan was accepted by the Illinois Commerce Commission, and as a result, Ameren, Illinois became a much less prominent player in the bill, making the Future Energy Jobs Act largely a project of ComEd and thus Northern Illinois. The Future Energy Jobs Act is important because, unlike the Chicago Climate Action Plan, it provides large energy companies with major incentives to meet efficiency goals, with bonuses for exceeding targets and penalties for falling short, and thus has more potential to create concrete results. In addition to improving energy efficiency, the bill also calls for an expansion of affordable solar options, greater investment in renewable energy, and funds for job training and payment help. It should be said that within the Chicago Climate Action Plan, specific strategies also are accompanied with specific decreases in emissions that they expect the policies to result in. For this project, we wanted to capitalize on these movements that already exist. Our proposal seeks to address the 5 primary strategies of the Chicago Climate Action Plan, but provide even more real incentives and penalties beyond the Future Energy Jobs Act in order to ensure that these innovative but realistic goals get set into motion.
2014 data from the World Research Institute shows that the two largest emitters of carbon dioxide in the state of Illinois are electric power and transportation, with 29.89 and 23.04% of the state's CO2 emissions, respectively. Industrial, residential, and commercial buildings, as well as agriculture, are the following four largest sources of carbon dioxide emissions in Illinois. These trends explain our focus on public transportation, biofuel, and buildings. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the more drastic action taken to reduce emissions, the less the global temperature will increase in this century. As the goal of the Paris Accord, and thus of the U.S. Climate Alliance, is to reduce the global temperature, our policy will focus on reducing carbon dioxide emissions, as carbon dioxide is the most pervasive and impactful of greenhouse gases.
The Chicago Climate Action Plan set two bold emissions reductions goals in 2008, to reduce emissions by 25% of 1990 levels by 2020 and by 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, carbon dioxide emissions for Illinois were 192.9 million metric tons in 1990 and 241.4 million metric tons in 2008. Thus, if the state of Illinois were to parallel their emissions reductions goals with the city of Chicago, they would be seeking to emit only 193.2 million metric tons of CO2 by 2020 and 147.1 million metric tons by 2050. Between 2008 and 2015, Illinois experienced real reductions in emissions. Total emissions for the state decreased by 22.2 million metric tons, or 11.51% of 1990 Illinois emissions. This means that to reach 25% reduction by 2020, Illinois would have to reduce CO2 emissions by another 26 million metric tons, a greater decrease in a shorter period of time, a goal which we believe that our proposal can help Illinois to achieve. An important note is that CO2 emissions are not decreasing uniformly across sectors. Electric power is the only sector to have reduced emissions consistently and dramatically between 2008 and 2015. With the Future Energy Jobs Act, it is likely that emissions will continue to decrease in this sector. This is significant because the largest source of CO2 emissions in Illinois comes from the generation of electric power, which makes up almost 40% of total emissions, followed by transportation, responsible for approximately 28.3% of all state emissions. These numbers differ from the data provided earlier because the World Research Institute uses the unit of carbon dioxide equivalents for their analysis, while the U.S. Energy Administration uses direct CO2 emissions. The transportation sector has not experienced a consistent reduction in emissions. Instead, 2015 levels were higher than 2008 levels. Thus, our proposal, a program with an emphasis on producing biofuel that would be compatible with cars, could be a hugely beneficial investment in this regard.
Public transportation plays a huge role in the green future of Illinois, especially the Chicago metropolitan area. Expanding public transportation and walking, as well as bicycling paths, will give citizens of the Chicago metropolitan area clean alternatives to driving cars while saving them money. According to the Chicago Climate Action Plan, Chicago is the nation's second largest transit system, with an annual ridership of 1.6 million rides. Approximately a third of those are by train and two-thirds by bus. To seriously cut emissions from the Chicago metropolitan area, the regional transit system needs to follow the CCAP's plan to both expand and increase the efficiency of public transportation. The expansion of public transportation will create more jobs in short and long term through expansion, construction, and maintenance. Illinois will earn additional revenue from fare as well as from expanded advertising within public transportation. The city of Chicago has received $153.1 million in U.S. Department of Transportation funds to reduce traffic congestion. This money will aid the public transportation expansion. Switching from driving a car to using public transportation can save consumers up to $400 a month, and a 30% increase in CTA ridership can result in a 0.83 million metric ton reduction in CO2 emissions. This is the estimated decrease in emissions given current transportation technology. Emissions can be expected to decrease up to an additional 75% with our proposal of biodiesel. The CCAP aims to double the number of walking and bicycling trips per year to 1 million by expanding walking and biking lanes. The Divvy Bike Share program is already pretty expansive and has begun to be brought into less affluent neighborhoods of the city. Growing bicycle ridership and expanding bike lanes to all parts of the Chicago metropolitan area is essential in reducing emissions. Switching from cars to bicycles can save consumers transportation expenses and contribute to health improvements. The Chicago Climate Action Plan is an important step towards reducing emissions. However, it still relies heavily on electric and gasoline, two of the largest sources of emissions. Our plan takes the next step in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by utilizing biofuel, specifically biodiesel in public transportation. All of the municipal buses within Chicago operate on diesel, with 170 of the newest buses being hybrids. Both hybrid diesel and diesel buses can run on biodiesel. Using biodiesel reduces greenhouse gas emissions because carbon dioxide released from biodiesel combustion is offset by the carbon dioxide absorbed from growing soybeans or other feedstocks used to produce the fuel. Life cycle analysis completed by Argonne National Laboratory found that biodiesel use can reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 74% compared with petroleum diesel. Buildings contribute to a large portion of the emissions within the state of Illinois and the greater Chicago metropolitan area. To reduce emissions generated from electric power, there are two main routes to take: reducing electric power generated and switching the source of power. Both of these actions will be necessary for a realistic plan to reduce emissions in the state of Illinois. Luckily, through the Future Energy Job Acts, ComEd, or Commonwealth Edison, a branch of Exelon, has committed to taking action in both of these areas. More concretely, ComEd has promised to reduce electricity waste by 21.5% by 2030. One major route for reducing electricity waste comes from upgrading to a higher efficiency lifestyle through appliances and buildings. Our proposal adds to ComEd's menu of efficiency programs that consumers and contractors can access, providing them with lower energy bills in the long run and allowing ComEd to take advantage of government incentives. The City of Chicago has a fairly strong existing program for incentivizing green infrastructure within municipal and commercial buildings. The next step is to provide similar incentives for residential buildings. For private homes, we recommend a program similar to California's Energy Upgrade California, where rebates are given to consumers based on percentage decrease in energy consumed, up to $4,000. These rebates are not limited to specific products, providing incentives for competition within the energy-efficient building market.
One way to reduce CO2 emissions is to replace the use of petroleum. Biofuel has showed signs of being that potential replacement. Biofuel comes from biomass, which is derived from crops, plant residues, and other biological materials. Illinois is a leading producer of two forms of biofuel, biodiesel and ethanol. Corn ethanol could reduce CO2 emissions by 19 to 48%, and cellulosic ethanol could reduce CO2 emissions by up to 115%. There are some that believe more energy from fossil fuel is required to produce ethanol than ethanol provides as fuel, but the Argonne National Laboratory reported that the fuel-to-petroleum ratio is 10, meaning that for 1 British thermal unit of petroleum, 10 British thermal units of ethanol fuel is produced for both corn ethanol and cellulosic ethanol. It might be less efficient than gasoline, as the chart displays, but there are fewer greenhouse gas emissions from ethanol. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, there are 12.3 metric tons of sustainable biomass resources already available each year in Illinois. This is definitely a resource that Illinois could capitalize on based on resources and the existing infrastructure. Not only do they have biofuel and ethanol producing facilities, but these facilities can be cheaply upgraded to produce more advanced biofuels from perennial energy crops, like miscanthus and switchgrass. These crops are high-yielding and can be grown on marginal land, but farmers take higher risks to grow them because they require a longer establishment period and higher upfront costs than regular crops. No farmer likes risky and delayed returns on growing their crop. One possibility is to create something like the already existing Biomass Crop Assistance Program to incentivize growing perennial energy crops. Regulations to subsidize 100% of the established costs of perennial crops would be the optimal subsidy rate, according to a paper by Miao and Khanna. With this as an offer for Illinois farmers, the cellulosic ethanol productions could take off. The positives are that as petroleum consumption decreases and biofuel consumption increases, greenhouse gas emissions will decrease and the cost of importing a fuel decreases. This provides Illinois with greater energy security and also the hypothetical of considering an export of biofuel across the U.S., given Illinois' central geographic location. One cost could be the fact that Illinois relies on nuclear power for a lot of its energy consumption, but passing agricultural subsidies to increase biomass production would not get in the way of nuclear power lobbyists, and nuclear power doesn't have as clear of a way to cut petroleum consumption. The Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Agriculture suggests that if the United States were to triple its biomass production, 1.1 million direct jobs and $260 billion in direct revenue could be generated. A larger bioenergy industry in Illinois would create jobs across a variety of sectors, and Illinois has the potential to be a leader in this industry.
Our proposal seeks to improve the energy efficiency of Chicago while making use of the natural resources of the entire state of Illinois. Biofuel addresses the problems of a struggling rural agricultural industry while providing a source of sustainable, low-emissions fuel for powering a large city. We hope that our proposal encourages the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago to recognize their own potential for becoming a true leader in this nation and in the world for strong climate action. Thank you.